The safari jeep rattled along the dusty path, its tires kicking up clouds of golden earth as the group of tourists peered eagerly into the vast African savannah. The evening sun bathed the landscape in a warm, amber glow, casting long shadows over the endless grasslands. Inside the vehicle, cameras clicked, voices whispered, and eyes scanned the horizon for movement. It was the perfect setting for an adventure, but no one was prepared for what was about to happen. Daniel, the seasoned ranger at the wheel, had guided hundreds of these tours before. He knew the land like the back of his hand, the patterns of the migrating herds, the secret water holes hidden behind thorny acacia trees, the places where the lions liked to rest during the heat of the day. But something made his fingers tighten on the steering wheel, a sensation deep in his gut telling him that today was different. A murmur swept through the jeep as one of the tourists pointed. There, in the grass. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, a shift in the tall golden blades that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Then, a figure emerged, majestic, powerful, deliberate. A lion. A fully grown male, his mane thick and wild, catching the sunlight like fire. His golden eyes locked onto the jeep, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The air inside the vehicle changed instantly. The excitement turned into something else, something heavier. Daniel's training kicked in. Lions often ignored safari jeeps, treating them as part of the landscape. But this one was different. He wasn't just passing through, he was coming straight toward them. The tourists fell silent. Some gripped their seats, others reached for their cameras with trembling hands. The tension was thick, pressing against their chests as the lion drew closer, his powerful muscles shifting beneath his tawny coat. Daniel's heart pounded. He had seen many lions before, but something about this one made his breath hitch. The way it moved, the way it held its gaze steady. It wasn't aggression, but it wasn't indifference either. The lion was studying them, making a choice. Then, just as the air in the jeep grew unbearably tight, the lion did something that no one, least of all Daniel, could have predicted. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as the lion took another step forward, its eyes fixed on him. The tourists behind him barely breathed, their whispers dying in their throats. Every instinct told him to stay still, to avoid sudden movements, but his body felt frozen in place, locked in the lion's steady gaze. Then, the lion did something no one expected. It let out a low, deep chuff, a sound that wasn't a growl, wasn't a warning, but something else entirely. Daniel knew that sound. Recognition flickered in his mind, but the thought was too impossible to grasp. Yet, as the lion moved closer, a memory pushed through, one buried under years of dust and time. Years ago, before he had become a well-known guide, before the tourists and the endless safaris, there had been a cub, a small injured thing he had found by the river, barely breathing, its frail body weak from dehydration and a wound on its leg. It had been abandoned, too young, too vulnerable to survive on its own. Daniel had made a choice that day, one he had never spoken about to anyone. Against every rule of nature, every warning about interfering, he had carried that cub to safety, cleaned its wound, fed it, and watched over it until it had the strength to stand again. He had named it Leo. When the time had come, he had done what he knew he must. He had taken the cub back to the wild, far from human settlements, where it could learn to live as it was meant to. He had watched from a distance as it hesitated for a moment, glancing back at him before disappearing into the tall grass. That was the last time he had seen it. Until now. The lion took another step forward, stopping just beside the jeep. Its golden eyes held his, searching, as if waiting for something. Daniel's breath caught, It was impossible. It had been too long. The wild was unforgiving, and lions did not remember humans. But this one did. Without thinking, Daniel whispered, "Leo?" The lion let out another deep breath, eyes softening, and in that moment, Daniel knew. It wasn't just any lion. It was the cub he had saved. And somehow, after all these years, it had found him again. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he processed what was happening. The lion, Leo, stood beside the jeep, closer than any wild lion should ever be. Yet there was no fear in his posture, no threat in his gaze. The tourists behind him remained frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing something beautiful or something dangerous. Daniel knew the answer. He had spent years guiding safaris, teaching people about the laws of the wild, about the unbreakable line between humans and animals. But here, in this moment, that line blurred. Against every rule of nature, against everything he had ever learned, Leo remembered him. It didn't make sense, but Daniel didn't need it to. Some things in life didn't need explaining. His hands trembled as he slowly reached out, not daring to move too quickly. He wasn't sure what he was doing. His instincts told him this was foolish, that no matter what history they shared, this was still a lion, still a predator. But his heart told him otherwise. Leo didn't flinch, he didn't back away. Instead, he let out another slow breath, his deep amber eyes never leaving Daniel's. The silence in the jeep was suffocating, but Daniel barely noticed. He had spent years wondering what had happened to the small cub he once nursed back to life. Had he survived? Had he found a pride? Had he learned to hunt, to rule, to be what he was meant to be? And now, he had his answer. Leo had survived. He had grown into a magnificent creature, strong and powerful. Yet, standing here, in this moment, he was still something more. He was still the same cub Daniel had once whispered to in the dead of night, promising him that he wasn't alone. And now, it was as if Leo had come back to say the same. The tourists behind him whispered in disbelief, but Daniel barely heard them. He knew that this moment, this impossible, extraordinary moment, was not meant to be shared, not meant to be understood by those who hadn't lived it. It was theirs alone. Then, just as suddenly as he had come, Leo blinked, let out a quiet, rumbling sound, and turned. Without hesitation, he walked away, disappearing into the tall grass once more. Daniel exhaled, his hands still shaking. Some bonds, no matter how impossible, could never be broken. Daniel sat frozen, his breath shallow, his heart still racing as he tried to grasp what had just happened. The voices of the tourists were distant, their whispers blurring into the background as his mind replayed the moment over and over. Leo had looked at him, not like a predator, not like a stranger, but as something more. As if time had not erased the bond they once shared. As if, despite the years, despite the wild, some part of that small, fragile cub still existed within the powerful creature that had just walked away. He had spent years telling others about the distance between humans and animals, about the instincts that ruled the wild, the way survival erased sentiment. But Leo had proved him wrong. Memory wasn't just a human trait. Loyalty wasn't just something felt by those who spoke. It lived in the unspoken, in the quiet recognition of a face once seen in a time of weakness, in the comfort of something once trusted. The tourists finally found their voices, their words tumbling over each other, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Some called it a miracle. Others struggled to accept that a lion could remember a human after all these years. They asked Daniel to explain, but he had no words for them. This wasn't something he could describe. It wasn't something he could fit into logic or science. It was something deeper, something few would ever understand. He thought back to the night he had found Leo as a cub, weak and vulnerable, his tiny body barely holding on to life. He had taken a risk saving him, knowing that once he was strong enough he would have to let him go. He had done what was right, what was necessary, but part of him had always wondered if Leo had made it, if the wild had been kind to him. Now he knew. Leo had found his place. He had become what he was always meant to be. But for one fleeting moment he had returned, not as a wild lion, not as a king of the savannah, but as something more, as a friend. Daniel closed his eyes, his heart still pounding. Some things in life did not need proof. Some things just were. Daniel's hands were still trembling, but it wasn't fear that made them shake. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy in his chest, pressing against the years of logic and reason that had always guided him. He had spent his life understanding the wild, studying its patterns, teaching others how it worked. Yet in one fleeting moment, everything he thought he knew had shifted. Leo had remembered. The tourists continued to talk, their voices rising in excitement, but Daniel barely heard them. They had witnessed something extraordinary, but they hadn't felt it, not the way he had. To them, it was a moment to tell others about, a story to repeat with wide eyes and disbelief. But to Daniel, it was something else. It was a whisper from the past, a reminder that kindness was never truly forgotten, that sometimes, even in a world ruled by instincts and survival, there were exceptions. He thought about the cub he had once held in his arms, the way he had fed him, cleaned his wounds, whispered to him in the dark when the world had been too big and too cruel. He had never expected anything in return. That was the way of nature. You gave, and then you let go. He had done exactly that. He had released Leo back into the wild, knowing he would never see him again. And yet, somehow, against all odds, he had. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He wondered what had brought Leo here today. Had it been coincidence? Had he simply wandered too close, curious about the human-filled jeep? Or had he known? Had something inside him recognized the scent, the voice, the presence of the man who had once saved his life? There was no way to answer that. No way to prove what Daniel already felt in his bones. But maybe it didn't matter. Maybe not everything in life needed to be understood. Some things just were. The tourists kept asking questions, waiting for him to explain what had just happened. But he didn't have the words. He only knew one thing. He would never see Leo again. But in those few seconds, they had shared something no one else ever could, and that was enough. Daniel remained silent as the jeep rumbled forward, the voices around him blending into a distant hum. His mind refused to move on, refusing to let go of what had just happened. He had always believed that nature followed its own rules, that animals lived by instinct, not emotion. But Leo had broken every expectation, every law of survival that Daniel had spent years teaching others. There had been no hunger in his eyes, no aggression, no territorial claim, just recognition, just something unexplainable yet undeniably real. He thought back to all the times he had questioned whether Leo had made it. There had been nights when the memory of that small cub had crept into his mind, making him wonder if he had done enough, if the wild had been fair, if fate had been kind. But now he had his answer. Leo had not only survived, but he had thrived. He had become something fierce, something powerful, something he was always meant to be. And yet, when he had the chance to walk away forever, he had chosen to pause, to remember. The tourists continued their excited chatter, throwing theories back and forth, each trying to explain what they had just seen. Some believed it was coincidence, that the lion had simply been curious. Others swore they had seen something more, something deep in its eyes that could not be ignored. But none of them truly understood. How could they? They had only witnessed a moment. Daniel had felt it. He wondered if Leo would remember this day the way he would. Would the lion continue his life as if nothing had changed, disappearing into the endless plains, his past nothing more than a shadow in his mind? Or had this moment meant something to him too? Was there a part of him that knew, even for just a second, that he had once been saved, that there had once been a man who had carried him when he had no strength of his own? There were no answers. There never would be. But Daniel didn't need them. He had seen something today that could never be explained, something that lived beyond logic, beyond instinct, beyond words. And for the rest of his life he knew he would carry this moment, just as Leo had carried something of him. The jeep moved forward, the dust settling behind them, but Daniel's thoughts remained stuck in that moment, frozen in time. He knew the savannah would return to normal. The herds would keep moving. The sun would rise and fall, and the land would continue its endless cycle, untouched by the strange connection that had just unfolded. But he would never see the wild the same way again. He had spent years teaching people about nature's rules, about how animals operated on instinct, how survival always came first. And yet, Leo had reminded him of something different. There was something deeper, something that science could not measure and logic could not define. It was memory, it was trust. It was something rare and fleeting, a whisper from the past that had traveled across time and distance to say, "I remember you." The tourists would return home with their photos and stories, telling friends about the day a lion approached their jeep. But for Daniel, it wasn't just an encounter. It was proof of something unspoken, something most people would never witness in their lifetime. Leo had survived. He had ruled his land. And for one brief moment he had chosen to come back. Not because he needed anything, not because of hunger or territory, but because some bonds refused to be broken. The land stretched endlessly ahead, but Daniel kept looking back, as if hoping to see that golden mane once more, just for a second longer. But he knew Leo was gone, returning to the life he was meant to live. And that was how it should be. As the sun began to dip, Daniel finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Some things in life are not meant to be explained. Some connections defy logic. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest kindness we ever give isn't forgotten. Not by time, not by distance, not even by those who cannot speak our language. So ask yourself, what kindness have you given that might still be remembered? What moments of love, of care, of connection have left ripples in places you may never see again? Because somewhere, someone, or something might still carry that memory, just like Leo had. And one day, against all odds, it might just come back to you,